I'm going to be very brief because I know the senator has a busy day. I wanted to introduce Senator Cortez Masto to provide brief remarks this morning.
Good morning. How's everyone this morning? Okay, good. I'm glad to see and hear and see all of you. Let me first of all just say thank you to my colleague, Senator Duckworth, and to the terrific organizations that have come together to support this, what I think we all believe is crucial research into women voters of color and their concerns. It is heartening for me to see data confirming what I think we already know, right? We live it every single day. African American, Latina, AAPI women are using their voices and standing up for themselves to demand action on policies that are affecting their families and their communities. Because women are all engaged like never before. I don't know if you feel it, I see it every single day. And it's vital that we pay attention to their priorities. Things like healthcare, the environment, reproductive justice and discrimination, including the GOP's attempt to suppress voters of color across the country. We also need to make sure to connect with them throughout the political process. It's not enough to reach out to key voters right before an election. I'm the first to tell you that, particularly coming from the state of Nevada. We have a beautifully diverse population. But what is important is we are engaging all the time. We are talking, we are engaging, we are sitting around our kitchen tables and talking about the issues that matter. We know it. And so that is really what is important. If we are not only going to listen to their voices, but at the end of the day, help make change in a positive way for all of our communities. That's what this is about. Women want Congress to listen to their voices, to work together and fight for their concerns right here in Washington. And we expect members of Congress to be advocates on all of our issues, all of the time, not just before elections. That's why I am so proud to represent Nevada, which I've always said is a microcosm of the rest of the country. If you don't know anything about Nevada, know this, and I was born and raised here. We have a third of the population are Latinx. We have the fastest growing AAPI community in the country, and still a strong, vibrant African American community. And it is wonderful to see that. And you know, we are in the middle of elections, and I tell people, from our presidents to everyone that's running for office in Nevada, if you want to engage, if you want to say that you're representing all of our communities, then you need to go out and talk to them. And you need to talk about the issues that matter to them and listen to what they are saying. And you do it now. You don't do it 6 months before election. You don't do it 3 weeks before an election. You're engaging all the time, because I'm here to tell you the issues that matter to all of our communities. There's a common thread amongst all of them. But we have to show up, and we have to have those conversations. I have worked very hard throughout my career, whether I was an attorney general or even now as the first female senator, first Latina in the United States Senate, to reach out to all of our communities and talk on a regular basis. Anytime I get home, the most important thing is just to engage our communities and listen and hear what their concerns are so that I can be their voices back here in Washington. I feel that responsibility, and I think we all have that responsibility to open that door and make sure our voices are being heard. The issues that matter to us are being talked about right here in Washington. And that's why I'm so grateful for the polling and the continued, really, conversation about what is important for our communities at the end of the day and what matters to women. I will tell you this, I'm also committed to the education and awareness around key issues that affect our communities of color, but the other issue is the 2020 census. If you haven't been paying attention, this has been a vehicle by which this administration and some of my Republican colleagues want to continue to suppress our communities and take away our voices. And we should all be counted. That's what this is about. Everybody has the right and the voice to be heard and to be counted in this country. And my fight has been to make sure that not only are there resources for that census, that they're utilizing those resources effectively, and they're talking to everyone and counting everyone in our communities. The other area that I have found after talking to so many members in our community centers around healthcare, particularly for women. reproductive freedom. I don't know about you, but reproductive freedom that I find, not only personally for me as a woman, but the women that I talk to, that is a priority. It also matters that you have access to affordable health care when you need it. And believe it or not, there is a comfort that comes in knowing that you can access that affordable health care when you need it. And the dignity that brings to families. This happens in my own family. I have seen, unfortunately, too many people, whether it is seniors or people that don't have access to health care, they forego it. And they're only showing up at a time when it's acute. And in this country, we have the right to preventative care. We have the right to make sure that we are focused on what our needs are for all of our communities. And that, to me, is the biggest challenge that we have, to make sure that everybody has that access and everybody has that comfort moving forward. The ACA and the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, whatever you want to call it, has brought that level of comfort. That preventative care to women, the support that we need, not only for ourselves, but for our families. And to me, that's worth fighting for. I don't know about you, but to me, that is the fight today, because there's a stark difference between those who are fighting to make sure that you can keep your health care, it's affordable, and we're not taking it away, and those that completely want to repeal it, take it away, and not do anything with it. That's the stark contrast that I see in the discussions, particularly on the floor of the Senate. The other thing that I'm very proud of in Nevada, if you don't know this, we have worked very hard because of our beautiful diversity to make sure that more women are engaged in opening that door. So I have fought hard along with Harry Reid and many others in my state to make sure that we are reaching out and giving everybody that equal opportunity to be a voice in their community. That's why our Nevada legislature, which is democratically controlled, but a majority of our legislature are women, and women of color. That's unique. It doesn't happen anywhere else in this country other than in Nevada. And because we've had those more women and women of color, what do you think the issues we talked about during our legislative session that we were able to pass and work on behalf of our families, on behalf of our individual rights? I mean, that's the difference, right? That's the difference, that we bring our voices, our concerns, the issues that matter, and we get things done. Very proud of that in the state of Nevada. I have worked on so many issues over the course of my career and will continue to do so, but I will say this, it is nice to have friends and partners at the table with me. And the minute that we have the data now to tell our story and what we are fighting for, we all now have a responsibility as you leave here and you learn this information, not only to make that sure that door is open, but you're continuing to fight to make our voices heard. That's the importance of this information, to tell our stories, to give everybody and arm everyone else, including women, with the information they need to fight for the issues that matter to all of us. So I'm so proud to be a part of this today on what you are doing in releasing this poll, and I just want to say thank you. Thank you for caring enough to take the time and effort, because I know it's not easy, to gather this information, share the data where it always begins with all of us, so now we can use it to turn it into positive change and issues that matter for women in our community. So thank you, and thank you for inviting me this morning. Thank you all for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Senator Cortez Masto, for those kickoff remarks. The Senator actually touched on quite a bit of what we covered in our poll. Again, thank you all for joining us today for this briefing. Our three organizations conducted this poll to better understand what motivated women of color to vote and what issues we care about. I'm gonna start with introductions. I have introduced myself, but I wanted to just briefly invite Jessica and Marcela to introduce themselves as well.
Hi everyone, my name is Jessica Gonzalez Rojas, and I'm the Executive Director of the National Latina Institute for Reproductive Health.
Hello, my name is Marcella Howell. I'm the founder and president of In Our Own Voice, National Black Women's Reproductive Justice Agenda.
Thank you, Jessica, Marcella, for your continued partnership. To elevate the voices of women of color, our three organizations joined together to form the collaborative. We call ourselves the Intersections of Our Lives. And together, we believe very firmly that reproductive justice will only be achieved when all people of all immigration statuses have agency, economic, social, and political power, along with resources to define and make decisions about our bodies, our health, our sexuality, our families, and communities in all of the areas of our lives with dignity and self-determination. In recent years, this should be no surprise, we've seen women of color becoming an increasingly strong voice in our electorate. So based on voter turnout data in 43 states where this data is available, turnout of women of color nearly doubled in our latest analysis from the last midterm election from 6.5 million to 11.1 million, representing a whopping 10% of the electorate in the 2018 midterms. That is certainly now enough to make a difference in the results. So to truly understand what motivated women of color to vote and the issues we care most about, Intersections of Our Lives conducted this nationwide poll of African American women, Latinas, and Asian American Pacific Islander women. These are our sample sizes. So what we found was that 88% of women of color said that the stakes were too high in the 2018 midterm elections not to vote. And that was 9 in 10 women of color voters saying they were absolutely certain they would vote. So we asked them, as you were heading to the election, like how were you thinking about whether or not you were going to vote? And 9 in 10 women of color voters said, we're gonna vote. Things are too important for us not to. And this is because women of color voters told us that they are overwhelmingly concerned about the state of our country, with 75% of us using words like angry, disgusted, scared, sad, and nervous to describe our emotions. Just some examples, 42% of Black women said they were disgusted, 32% of Latinas and AAPI women said that they were disgusted, 10% of AAPI women said that we were angry, as did 9% of Black women and Latinas. 85% of Black women said they were frightened for the next generation. That's 85% of Black women, scared for the next generation. 72% of Latinas and 65% of AAPI women agreed with them. And women of color also told us that they are very concerned about the seeming disregard for the facts lately, with 90% of us saying that this disregard for the facts is very concerning. So it's no surprise, as I've already mentioned, we are a powerful voting bloc. From this powerful voting bloc, we thought it would be a missed opportunity to not ask what types of candidates women of color supported. 3/4 of women of color voters supported the Democratic candidates in both statewide and federal races in 2018. And 1 in 5 women of color voters supported Republican candidates in statewide and federal races in 2018. Women of color voters told us that they were voting specifically because we desired a change, and we voted to support candidates that reflect our values. 30% of women of color who voted for a Democratic member of Congress said their vote represented this need for change. And 28% of women of color who voted for a Republican member of Congress did so to reflect their values. And as Senator Cortez Masto mentioned in her opening remarks this morning, while women of color were passionate about having our voices heard this election, We also learned that far too many of us are concerned about whether our votes ultimately counted. 23% of women of color voters did not think their vote was accurately counted. That's almost a quarter of women of color voters in 2018. And 33% of women of color voters experienced an issue voting, such as being asked to show an ID to an election official. So more specifically, 35% of Black women voters in Florida in particular questioned whether their vote was counted accurately, and 27% of women of color with a household income of less than $50,000 a year shared this concern. So there's a widespread, deeply concerning reality that women of color want our elected officials and election administrators to fix the fact that almost a quarter of us believe that our votes are not being accurately accounted for. We believe that everyone who wants to participate in our democracy should have the opportunity to and feel confident that our voices are being accurately heard. I'll finish with some very brief final thoughts. The bottom line for us to share this morning is women of color are participating in our elections at higher numbers than ever before. We are demanding that our voices and perspectives cannot be ignored. I'm going to turn it over to Jessica now.
Thank you, Jennifer. So I'm going to share more about insights in terms of what we learned in regarding the policy priorities that women of color cared most about. What the poll confirmed was that women of color perceive policies intersectionally, and their collective experiences are a strong motivator to demand that elected officials take a stand and support policies that achieve justice and equity for our communities. So to be very, very clear though, women of color are not a monolith, right? But even within our racial and ethnic groups, our experiences, our backgrounds, our challenges, they're all very different. But there's the intersectionality, right? The layering of our beliefs that come from sharing similar experiences of inequity. We've been discriminated against because of our skin color, the language we speak, our last name, or having to overcome great barriers to succeed. And at the very, very core, what women of color care about is equality and justice, because we have a shared vision of fighting for our freedoms and our civil liberties. So what this slide is showing is what we learned from this research. There were 4 issues that women of color felt extremely important, where it was extremely important for their congressional representatives to address, and I'll share the ranking of that. 62% of women of color voters said ending racial, ethnic, and cultural discrimination was extremely important. 62% said ensuring people with pre-existing conditions can still access health care. Another 62% said ensuring access to clean water. And another 60% said ensuring everyone has access to affordable health care. So as you see, affordable health care really rises to the top, along with clean water and fighting discrimination. Other policy priorities that were at the top 10 for women of color included everything from protecting the U.S. from terrorism, ensuring children have high quality access to education, that women have the authority to make decisions about our own bodies and our own lives, passing common sense gun laws, protecting the environment, and ending the practice of separating families at the border. So again, these are a multitude of issues that our communities, that really connect with our communities and our lived experiences. Issues that women of color noted they were extremely important, but a little bit at the bottom end of that were things like good paying jobs. I mean, it's still 50%, so it's still high, but it was not as high as the other issues I mentioned. To stop making it harder for certain groups of people to vote, so access to the polls. Addressing the gender wage gap, we had that at 44%. Making childcare more affordable. And then, as you see a circle in red, when they were asked specifically on the issue of keeping abortion safe, legal, and accessible, 41% of women of color overall noted that this was an extremely important issue to them. However, looking back at the top 10 issues of priority, 56% of women of color noted that ensuring, so the language here is important, right? Ensuring that women have complete authority to make decisions about their bodies and lives was extremely important to them. So if you look at the language around safe, legal, accessible abortion versus ensuring women have the authority to make decisions about our bodies and lives, it's essentially the same concepts, but the ensuring, reproductive autonomy, essentially a bodily autonomy, rose a little bit higher in terms of messaging. There's a 15-point increase when abortion is framed under a message of agency, bodily autonomy, self-empowerment, instead of just the safe and legal language. And women of color know that the right to safe and legal abortion under Roe has not been a reality for many of us. Instead, using the frame of agency and autonomy is more powerful, and it's a more intersectional message for us. In terms of priorities for each ethnic and racial group, we found that Black women, the top 3 priorities were ending racial, ethnic, and cultural discrimination, the tie between ensuring people with pre-existing conditions can still access health insurance, and ensuring everyone has access to clean water. For Latinas, or Latinx women, priorities were ensuring that people with pre-existing conditions can still access health insurance. You see a theme here. Protecting the U.S. from terrorists, and ensuring access to clean water. And then the Asian American Pacific Islander community, the women, their priorities were ensuring access to clean water, ending racial, cultural, and ethnic discrimination, and ensuring everyone has access to affordable health care, and passing common sense gun reform. So again, you see a thread of commonality in terms of the issues that each of our communities care about. Another area that we learned that was important to women of color voters was the desire to have autonomy over their bodies and lives, which I mentioned before. 84% of women of color voters believe that candidates should support women making their own decisions about their reproductive health. And 9 in 10 women of color believe that when a woman has control over if, when, and how she has children, it provides both individual and societal benefits, right? So there's a social benefit here. And specifically, 93% of Asian Pacific Islander women agree that it's important that women can have control, have this control. 89% of Latinas and 87% of Black women agreed. So really high rates of support there. And although women of color across the board show strong support for similar issues, breaking down these results by age, by college education, by language, by ethnicity, reveal a wide array of issues that women rank in their top 3 priorities. And this illustrates that women of color certainly are not a monolith, right? So that's important to note. I'm sorry that the slide is not super clear, but you have it in your notebooks, in your folders. In Florida, the uniting issues are ensuring people with pre-existing conditions can still get health insurance. In Texas, the uniting issue is ensuring access to clean water. And what I think is incredibly powerful, given the moment that we're in now, and the renewed attacks by President Trump and the Republicans in Congress on our health care, on the Affordable Care Act, and on women of color in general, that we as women of color across the board believe that their elected leaders should prioritize that everyone have access to health care and affordability. The fact is that women of color are disproportionately more likely to be uninsured, even after the Affordable Care Act has been passed and been enacted. So it's no wonder that this is incredibly important to our community. So I'm going to take it and turn it over to Marcella, who will take us home with the data. Thank you.
This is by far the largest podium I've ever stood behind. I mean, I don't even know if you can see me, but I am here. We actually joked about maybe finding a little stool that would put both Jen and I, and actually Jessica too, up higher, but clearly this is a Senate podium. And so I will go ahead and, okay, I use Max, I'm sorry. So, one of the things that we found from talking to people, and again, I want to emphasize, we talked to women of color who had voted in the 2018 election. So we were asking them specifically what motivated them to vote, what issues, how they felt about their candidates. So it's really important to remember, we were actually talking to people who turned out in large numbers in 2018 and flipped the House of Representatives. So it's really important that people be cognizant of that. And it's critical that leaders in Washington prioritize and better understand what matters to women of color voters as we look toward 2020. We asked people how satisfied they were with the people they voted for, the candidates they voted for. And when it came to those candidates, 74% of women of color said that they felt satisfied with the candidates they chose in the 2018 election. So they were not voting against people, they were voting for the candidates that they cast their ballot for. And that's really important. While women of color were happy with their candidates and their choices, they also said they wanted to see more women and more candidates of color running in the next election. So again, 88% said they would prefer to see more women running, and 85% said they would prefer to see more candidates of color running, that more reflected what the United States actually looks like. So even though we've got the largest House of women in the House of Representatives now, women of color would like to see more. And it's important that people think about that. We also said some stuff that were very important, that it is too often that candidates running for office fail to acknowledge the issues that matter most to us. When we talk about people being pro-choice, being supportive of abortion, being supportive of reproductive freedom, you have to understand that the reason women of color use the terminology reproductive justice is because it is intersectional. Reproductive justice is not just about the womb, it is about economics, it is about immigration status. It is basically about being able to decide whether and when to have children, not just whether or when to terminate a pregnancy. So it's really important in terms of how people talk about it. And as a woman of color, I want my elected officials to understand that my experiences and my needs are different from white women voters. That we see things differently because of the lived experiences that all of us have had. We also want, and we asked very specifically, why did you put people in office? Why did you flip the House? People want to see folks work together. They want results. They don't want to have just ongoing bickering. They saw that for 8 years and they don't want to see it anymore. They really do want some results. And in some cases, they actually said they would like to see some compromise to get some of those results. The other point that's really important, you know when you go to the polls and you vote and then you get that little sign that says, I voted? What women of color are saying is that they carry that I voted to the next step. They are going to be watching the candidates that they put into office. They want to make sure that those candidates are abiding by the promises that they made to them. That they are going to make sure that those issues that happen, that they're voting on, reflect what their needs are and the reason that they voted for those people. And so it's really important, again, that candidates are aware of that, elected officials are aware of that this is called, I am a voter and my voting has accountability, I'm engaged, I want to make sure that people are voting the way I think they should, and I'm going to hold them accountable. And we very rarely get people saying that, but here we had it very, very clearly that 62% of women of color said, we're watching you. And we want to make sure that people know that. So the other pieces, our policy priorities, as we said, are rooted in our collective belief that reproductive justice will only be achieved with all people of all immigration statuses, all economic statuses, have the agency, and you heard that word earlier, economic, social, and political power and resources to define and make decisions about our bodies, our health, our sexuality, our families, and our communities in all areas of our lives, and we get to make those decisions with dignity and self-determination. Together, our organizations are focused on working with Congress to advance explicitly intersectional policies that speak to the specific needs and concerns of women of color and how they might differ from white women. And I mentioned a couple of those things. We want to ensure abortion is accessible, not just legal, but accessible. And accessible means getting rid of laws that cost you to have to travel. It means getting rid of laws where you get inaccurate information that is mandated by the state. It means getting rid of laws that force you to have an unnecessary ultrasound, that make you have to come back 24 to 48 to 72 hours later. Those are the kind of things that impact women of color who are predominantly in these southern states and southwest states that have these horrible laws, and Ohio. I could not leave out Ohio. And so it is important for us that we advance sexual and reproductive health policies, that we end violence against women of color, that we protect immigrant rights and health, and that we ensure economic and environmental justice for women of color. If you note in the poll, everyone talked about clean water. There's a reason for that. Environmental justice is extremely important when you look at neighborhoods where predominantly people of color live. And people ignore that, including the environmental community. They need to start paying attention to environmental justice, not just clean water, clean air, but what it means to have dumps in your community, what it means to have buildings that are not being repaired. And all of that leads into how we feel about these issues. We are a collective voting power. 2018 proved that. And we plan to be a voting power in 2020. That's one of the reasons why we are working together. We are working together with the constituencies that we support in various states across this country, and we will continue to work with them, both in terms of encouraging them to make their voices heard with the people they have just elected, but to make their issues prominent as they listen to candidates who come back who want to run again and get reelected or get elected for the first time. We are working to expand the right to vote to ensure that women of color can have a say in this democracy. And in that sense, we are also fighting very much against any voter suppression laws that exist and trying to get those changed. So our work leads into what your work is with your members. And we want to make sure that the members understand how we feel about issues and how we will continue to vote on those issues. That's why we thought this poll was so important, that we were literally talking to voters who had a hand in changing the face of the House of Representatives. And we expect that they will have a hand in changing the face of the Senate and the White House. And so we want to encourage all of you to share this information with your bosses, to share this information with your colleagues. We will get these slides to Senator Duckworth's office, and she can send them around to everyone that has come in. And I want to thank you all for coming here. And now, if you have any questions, I'm going back to my chair, and you can ask us some questions.
First of all, thank you so much for this data. This is so helpful. Incredible. Thank you. I have a point of clarification and then I have a question. I love the data on the disaggregation. Don't see it in the folder. Will it also be emails to the people who are RSVP that aren't?
We can make sure that the disaggregated data, including some crosstabs, get sent around. We also have a landing page. The website actually holds a lot of the handouts in your folders and more. That website is intersectionsofourlives.org. And then in addition to the polling data, we did want to also provide some concrete information about bills that our 3 organizations collaborate on. That document is this document here. It's got a list of our policy priorities as well. So we also don't just poll our people, but we do advocacy as a collaborative.
Thank you so much. And then the question that I had, did housing, did housing come up? And if so, what was the data on that?
I believe housing did come up. I don't think it was it in our first, I think it was in that first slide with the issues.
Yeah, let's see if we can go back and look at it.
No, do not
I'm on a
apologize.
sleep strike, and so when
Yeah.
I'm trying, I'm like,
I know,
it's not
kind of
much
hard.
So we have extremely important, healthcare, education, gun laws. So it looks like housing is in the second tier issues. 44% of women of color say that creating more affordable housing options is extremely important. 58% of Black women, 43% of Latinas, and 32% of AAPI women.
Thank you.
You're welcome. In the back?
Is it me? Oh, sorry. Hi, thank you. I may be asking a couple of questions that you have covered, but I have poor vision, so I couldn't see the slides. But I was curious about the intersection of your work with regards to people with disabilities. So either both in the demographics that you surveyed, and then which may come out in the data that you'll be sending out, but then also in the issues that you covered, obviously healthcare, but just in general, I'm thinking about also access to voting for people with disabilities and things like that as well.
I'm not sure that we asked a specific question about the intersection of the topics we polled on and disability. Is that right?
Well, it's just like wondering like how you phrase your questions so that they're inclusive of people with disabilities or issues that impact people with disabilities, kind of at the intersection of, being a woman and a person with disability, or a woman of color and a person with disability.
Got it. I would have to look back at the actual raw poll at how we asked those questions, and I would be happy to do that. If you would like to leave your info, I would get back to you about that.
Definitely. Thanks.
Thank you for the question.
Yes.
Thank you again. This is a great presentation. I was just wondering about what your predictions would be about how these numbers would change between the 2018 and 2020 elections, just because typically there are larger turnouts for federal elections and there are congressional elections.
Well, typically, women of color turnout drops at midterm. This time it increased from 2014, significantly increased. And we would expect that it would at least stay at that higher level that we saw for the last presidential election, if not going higher. People are really, really engaged there. As we said, I think the most prominent word that they used was disgusted with what's going on in Washington right now. And the more we get, we make the connections between racist tweets and racist policies, we get more and more people engaged. And that's what's really important, that we're looking at those kind of things, and our advocacy does that. And so I would expect that it will be increased quite significantly.
And I would just add, because the sample is very representative, and again, I don't know if we said this, the poll was offered in 5 languages, English, Spanish, Korean, Mandarin, and Vietnamese. So we wanted to make sure it was accessible to folks with different language needs. So I imagine the issues may remain sort of the same flow, maybe again up higher, given the intensity of the conversations that are going to happen. But again, racial, ethnic, cultural discrimination at the top of that list, access to healthcare, whether it's a pre-existing conditions or just access to affordable healthcare, and then clean water. These are still issues that, this was only taken in February or January?
Yeah.
February this year as a reflection of their motivation in 2018. So we imagine that these issues will remain salient, and given the national discourse, maybe even higher.
I just have one thing to add on the question about the intersection with disability rights.
Mhm.
And I believe your organizations also work specifically on, like I believe the memo earlier this year was the disability rights advocates about sort of ways that we can approach the intersections there,
Mhm.
maybe and I think kind of what you're talking about.
Yeah.
And I know it's more limited than what I'm here, but the concept of bodily autonomy and being able
Yes.
to make your own decision, I think that was from that previous period really resonated with me.
Yeah.
My question though is on, we were talking about the perception that votes are not being reported accurately. Can you talk a little bit more about that? Is that the perception that there's election interference? Is it the perception that someone is asking for their ID and it's happening based on being a person of color or not person?
Well, people did say that they didn't really feel that on election day they were interfered with, even though they had to show their ID at some point. What they were concerned about was what happened afterwards and whether or not their votes were being counted properly. And if you remember, in some of the states, there were a lot of questions about what was happening to votes. And people, and it was specifically, it was very, very high with Black voters. Black voters felt that their votes were not being counted, and that somehow that here they were turning out in these large numbers to vote, but they were unsure about how they were being recorded. And that was across the board, but like in Texas, I think it was higher for Latinas, and that they felt that their votes weren't being counted as well. And so, yeah, it's a question of how do we now record our votes in an election cycle where there is an attempt to suppress the vote, and yet the people who are trying to suppress the votes are also in charge of counting the votes. And that's what was being raised a lot.
We also did some canvassing in neighborhoods outside of Atlanta, and a few other topics that came up around concern for votes not being counted was around absentee ballots. We worked with a lot of voters who were older and didn't think they could physically be at the polls, and a lot of the anecdotal stories we heard from the 2018 midterms were that people questioned whether their absentee ballots made it, or whether they were going to be processed accurately or counted. And a lot of people just didn't receive them, even though they had signed up for absentee ballots. So that's a little bit more flavor. It's 43 states where the data are available. We would have to pull that, yes. But please leave your info and we can pull that for you.
Yeah, I had a question about the clean water finding as a top tier issue, and if that surprised you, if you have any additional insight on what that really means to individuals, and if your own talking points or work will incorporate that at all?
Interesting enough, we also did a poll during the Kavanaugh hearings where we polled women of color again and asked them about the Supreme Court and the issues going on around choosing Supreme Courts, and what they personally felt the Supreme Court had, how they had an impact on their lives. Clean water came up in that one too, again across the board. And in a poll that we did with Black women, we also found that a third of the Black women that we surveyed said that they had brown water coming out of their faucets. So clean water is that environmental justice component that we're talking about. And all of us have started to talk about that in our own outreach to people, but we will probably start to do a little bit more on environmental justice, because it clearly is something that voters, women of color voters, are concerned about. And I think it goes hand in hand with wanting to have neighborhoods where they can raise their children in safe and healthy environments, and that comes with that, and that's part of reproductive justice.
If you refer to the third page of the bills handout, there is an environmental justice bill that our 3 organizations support. That is the Water Affordability, Transparency, Equity, and Reliability Act. It's Senate Bill 611. That's the Rep. Lawrence and Senator Sanders bill that would make water service safer and more affordable.
You know, one thing I'll add is that, you know, the poll's really elucidating to the issues that we know already exist in our communities. So the senator mentioned this, right? We all know these issues, but having the data is really helpful. But one example of clean water issues that we do organizing in South Texas, and in places like Corpus Christi and the Rio Grande Valley, standing water is a problem. So it brings mosquitoes and brings, you know, infections. And the folks that are doing community organizing on the ground around reproductive health and justice issues draw that connection very succinctly in their lives because they're literally wading through that, right? So while it was a surprise, and I think particularly when we did the first poll with the Kavanaugh, during the Kavanaugh hearings, that were like, oh, clean water, and then it goes like, of course that makes sense, right? So I think, again, it sort of elucidates what we know to be the issues in our community that we care about, but it was fascinating to see a real trend across AAPI, Black and Latino women.
Yes? Oh, sorry. Oh, right here, and then.
In terms of the environmental justice reporting and information you gathered, did you consider clean, safe products? For example, personal care products are highly unregulated and contain toxic chemicals that predominantly affect women.
One of the organizations, our organization is a national state partnership, and we have 8 Black women's RJ organizations that we work with. One of them is Black Women for Wellness in California. They do a lot around beauty products and the kind of carcinogens that are in them. And we can get you some more information on what they are really pushing out. They've done a lot of work around that, and we're starting to try and get all of our partner organizations to really do some more work around that. And
No, I just think it's a really important intersection, right? These are things like tampons and things that we're actually putting into our body that impact our health are really important. I don't know that we had added that to the poll, but it is an issue that many of us are looking at and caring about. And there's a couple of good national campaigns that are addressing it as well, in addition to.
I might add, those of you who go out and get your nails done, you might want to think about that too. In nail salons and stuff, there's a reason why the people who do your nails wear those little masks. It's because of the kind of fumes and everything in there. You might want to ask to have a mask yourself in terms of because what Black Women for Wellness did is they looked at the people who are behind those tables who are actually doing the work on your nails and how that is affecting their lungs and things.
And the stories that you hear about that specific concern tend to be around whether it's harming their reproductive health.
Yeah.
I know this isn't something that you particularly started, it's kind of general practice we have staffers that work on AAPI issues. I'm just wondering why Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders are lumped into the same group.
It's a really great question. One thing, and I don't know what the impetus of that was at the beginning, but one of the things that NAPAWF does is advocate for the disaggregation of all AAPI data. And so we do that in our equal pay work annually, but we more and more doing it at the intersection of all data that we encounter. Senator Cortez Masto mentioned the census. That is of great concern to our communities because of our work on disaggregated data. So I'm not sure about when the acronym or lumping began. I've also seen many iterations of that acronym, and it is one that I see shifting often. But we do stand very firmly, as I think do all communities of color, for better disaggregated data. And so often we see reports where Asian Americans don't even show up as a racial or ethnic group. So, thank you for your question.
And I think there's, what I would add too is that there's real health disparities when you start disaggregating data, or even economic injustices that you see where, lumped together, the statistics might be positive, but when you start disaggregating, you see like Hmong women actually face, the most barriers to economic justice or to cervical, they have the highest rates of cervical cancer, like those kind of things when you disaggregate. So it is an important effort that's happening, but I don't know the origins either. I think it's just, you think about the word Hispanic that was created by the government and lumps us all into one thing as well. So I think there's a lot of pushback that we need to do and to advocate for more disaggregated data. And that's why it was really important that we actually had language justice in this poll, and to do a poll in 5 languages is extremely expensive, but we're really committed to ensuring that we can ensure participation of diverse communities.
Hi. I just wondered if this was something you guys could speak a little bit more to that, the 2 questions you had on abortion or bodily autonomy and attestation you saw and how folks responded to it. How do you view that as translating to how, politicians and representatives should be speaking about this issue? And did you find that like certain states or groups responded in different numbers to those 2 questions?
I can speak writ large. The numbers are there. I know it's hard to see, but I think it's not to say to not say the word abortion. In fact, we're advocating say the word abortion, the word choice, women's health. Abortion's a particular procedure that we want people to speak about. But what we find, and I'll speak more for Latina Institute because we've been doing polling with our community for years. Is that it's more about the values than the procedure, right? Because the procedure's been, demonized in so many ways, and if you talk about, should it be illegal, legal in some cases, illegal, right? Like that spectrum, many Latinos actually fall a little more conservative. But if you ask the question, would you support a loved one who needed an abortion or decided to have one? 90% said yes. Do you think government should be making that decision for people? No, So in terms of the values, and that speaks to values of autonomy, dignity, right? Support is something meaning I'm going through something, I've made a decision, and I'm getting love and support. Like those values really resonate. So that's what we wanted to highlight. And again, it's something that our organization used in terms of our messaging and language. But then to see it sort of across the board was really interesting as well, right? So it's about elevating the framing around reproductive justice and abortion access in terms of a values-based conversation. Again, not shying away from the word, but acknowledging that it's more than that, right? Because it's not often the legal access that we're fighting for. It's like, as an immigrant woman, I might be denied access to that care because of my immigration status. It's so layered. So we want to fight for the values to ensure that folks can get the care that they need.
And another reason why I think our organizations do strive to fight for the values more intersectionally or comprehensively is because we actually, I'll just find the slide. We have a slide on, we have a slide illustrating just how intersectional women of color voters perceive the issue of reproductive justice. I'm not sure if that slide made it into this, but it's under hers, right? Yeah. Let's see. Yes. So this is we asked the question using reproductive justice language around women being able to control if, when, and how we have children. And then the second part of that question is, how it then provides both individual benefits to the pregnant person and societal benefits to that person, their family, and society. And so when you ask it that way, you get overwhelmingly high results, right? 9 in 10 women of color voters agree. And then there's some breakdowns under there. There is another slide that I'm thinking of that isn't in this, but is on our website, intersectionsofourlives.org, that actually illustrates just how intersectional we perceive the concept of being able to control if, when, and how we have children. And we actually asked, if we do have the ability to determine if, when, and how we have children, what benefits are then realized? And there's about a dozen or so benefits that poll extremely high, including things like the ability to work with dignity, including things like the ability to get an education, the ability to find a job, or to earn a living wage. So what that told us is that it's not just about, as Jessica said, a procedure, but the fact that our reproductive freedom then has ripple effects, not just on our own lives, but on society, our families, and the broader economy.
I just want to add a little historical context too. At the time after Roe v. Wade was decided, and so many people were talking about the right to have an abortion, it was the same period where Black and Latina women were being sterilized. So the issue of fighting for pro-choice, when it was all just about abortion, is the reason why the term reproductive justice was framed, because it really is about having the right to make the decisions about your own body without interference from politicians, without even, in terms of some of the polling, interference from your minister. That this is a decision a woman makes, and she gets to choose who gets to participate in that decision. And therefore she has autonomy over her own body, and looks at all the different kinds of things that may impact that. And so it was really important to do that kind of framing, because that's the way people think about this, is that this is not just a decision I'm making about terminating a pregnancy, it's also a decision about whether or when I want to have a child and what kind of impact that will have on my life and my family's life. And so all of those things get put into that it is about reproductive justice. And I'll give you an example that currently is right before your bosses. Labor HHS appropriations on the House side had the Hyde Amendment added into it in committee. Well, one of the things that we found, and one of the things that all of our organizations have worked on, is the Each Woman Act, to eliminate Hyde restrictions, not just at the federal level, but in the states. And to have that being one of the first appropriations things that happened was to add Hyde into it long before it came on the floor. Hyde Amendment has historical circumstances no matter who has been in charge of Congress or in charge of the White House. The Hyde Amendment is 40-something years old, and it's always been added. 43, thank you. And it's always been added. It impacts poor women, many of whom are women of color, young women, immigrant women. And so when you talk about reproductive freedom without justice doesn't help us. And so it's really important to know when those things that people are acting on impacts women of color. And that's the difference in how we talk about it and how people perceive it.
We are unfortunately out of time. If you want to learn more about the bill Marcella just mentioned, it's actually the first bill in the bill handout. It is Senate Bill 758. Thank you so much to my co-panelists. And if you have any questions, I think some of us can stick around for some one-on-one question and answer time.